I am 90 years old, and the only thing I regret is not what I did. It's what I allowed myself not to do. I buried my husband Richard 15 years ago. I cried at the funeral. Genuinely. But somewhere deep, in that place where an honest person only looks late at night, I felt something else. Not relief now. Something quieter and far more frightening. I felt that for the first time in 62 years, I had nowhere to be. No one to prove anything to. Nothing to prepare before he came home. I stood beside his casket in a black dress I had chosen myself, and I thought, when was the last time I chose anything on my own? I am not going to tell you a love story that justifies everything. I am going to tell you how a smart woman, and I was smart, believe me, can live 90 years and wake up one morning feeling that her real life never actually began. My name is Margaret. In 1958, I was offered a position as an editor at a publishing house in New York City. I was 22 years old, fresh out of university, and the dean of my faculty had written a letter of recommendation for me that he said, in his own words, he had not written for anyone in 20 years of teaching. I remember that letter almost by heart. I read it so many times that the paper along the folds became thin as skin. I never took that job. Robert walked into my life in the spring of 1957 with a smile that made you feel like the only person in a crowded room. He was tall, confident, and had that particular kind of charm that doesn't ask for your attention, it simply assumes it. I was 21. I had never been loved like that before. I didn't know yet that being the center of someone's world and losing yourself inside it can look exactly the same from the outside. We married in June of 1958. 3 weeks before my start date at the publishing house. Robert never told me not to take the job. I want to be precise about that, because for decades I told myself a cleaner version of this story, one where he was the villain and I was simply the victim of his demands. That version is easier to live with. But it is untrue. What he said was this: Maggie, New York is so far. And we're just starting out. Don't you want to build something here, together? That was all. 11 words. And I folded. I called the publishing house on a Tuesday morning in May. The phone felt heavier than I remembered phones feeling. I told the man on the other end that I was grateful, that something had come up, that I hoped they understood. He was polite. He said they did. He hung up before I finished my sentence. I stood in the kitchen of our new apartment, yellow walls, the smell of fresh paint still sharp in the air, and I told myself it was the right decision. That love was worth more than a job title. That New York would always be there. New York was always there. I was not. For the first few years, I told myself I was happy, and in the way that people are happy when they are busy and needed and surrounded by warmth, I suppose I was. Robert was a good provider. We had a house by 1961, a daughter, Carol, by 1962, and a son, Daniel, by 1964. I cooked. I cleaned. I organized every corner of a life that looked, from the outside, exactly the way a life was supposed to look. But at night, after the dishes were done and the children were asleep and Robert was reading the paper in his chair, I would sit at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold and feel something I had no name for then. I know its name now. It was absence. Not loneliness, I was never alone. Absence. The specific, hollow feeling of a version of yourself that never got to exist. I found the dean's letter once, in 1971. It had been folded inside an old textbook I hadn't opened in 13 years. I read it standing in the hallway, still in my coat, grocery bags at my feet. My hands were shaking slightly, not from cold, but from something I refused to examine too closely. Miss Margaret Holloway demonstrates a quality of mind I have rarely encountered in 4 decades of academic life. He had written. She does not simply understand language. She hears what it is trying to say. I put the letter back in the book. I put the book back on the shelf. I went to the kitchen and started dinner. I never took it out again. By 1973, Robert had built a small but stable insurance business. We were comfortable. Not wealthy comfortable. The house was paid off by then, the children were in school, and for the first time in our marriage I had something I hadn't expected: hours. Empty, unscheduled, unclaimed hours in the middle of the day. A woman down the street, Patricia Wren, had started a small literary magazine out of her basement. Nothing grand, 40 pages, printed locally, distributed to maybe 300 readers across the county, She knocked on my door one afternoon in September and asked if I would consider helping with editing. She had heard, she said, that I had studied literature. That I had a good eye. I said yes before she finished her sentence. For 8 months, I worked at Patricia's kitchen table every Tuesday and Thursday from 10 in the morning until 2 in the afternoon. I read manuscripts. I rewrote leads. I cut paragraphs that were drowning in their own words and watched the sentences underneath breathe for the first time. I was 37 years old and I felt, for those 8 months, like someone had opened a window in a room that had been sealed for 15 years. Then Robert came home early one Thursday in April. He didn't yell. Robert rarely yelled. He simply stood in the doorway of Patricia's kitchen, looked at the papers spread across the table, looked at me, and said, "I didn't realize this had become so serious." We drove home in silence. That evening he mentioned, quietly, that the house felt neglected. That Carol had mentioned to him she missed having me home after school, that he wasn't saying I had to stop, he was just sharing what he had noticed. I stopped the following Tuesday. I told Patricia I had too much on my plate. She looked at me for a long moment before she nodded. She knew. Women of that era always knew, and they never said it out loud, and that silence was its own kind of grief. In 1981, Carol left for college in Boston. Daniel followed 2 years later. The house, which had always felt slightly too small, suddenly felt vast in a way that made the walls ring. I was 45 years old. Robert's business was doing well enough that he hired 2 assistants and began coming home later, absorbed in the particular self-importance of a man whose work has finally exceeded his expectations. I had a house, a car, a weekly routine, and $340 in a savings account that I had been adding to quietly, $12 or $15 at a time, for 11 years without ever quite admitting to myself why. That year, I saw an advertisement in a local paper. A small publishing company in Hartford was looking for a part-time manuscript reader, no experience required, just a love of books and an attention to detail. Entry level. The kind of position a 20-year-old takes as a stepping stone. I was 45. I cut out the advertisement. I kept it in the pocket of my winter coat for 6 weeks. I never applied. Not because Robert told me not to. Because by 1981, I no longer needed him to tell me. I had learned to do it to myself. I had internalized his hesitation so completely that it had become indistinguishable from my own. That is the thing no one warns you about, the way another person's limits can quietly become the boundaries of your own imagination, and you stop noticing where they end and you begin. I threw the clipping away on a Tuesday in December. It was snowing. I remember watching it sink into the kitchen trash bin, landing on top of a coffee filter, the ink already beginning to blur. I made dinner. Robert came home at 7. I asked about his day. He talked for 40 minutes. I don't remember a single word he said. It was a Wednesday in March of 2003. Robert had been retired for 6 years by then, and his retirement had settled over our house like a second occupation. He was everywhere: in the kitchen when I was cooking, in the living room when I wanted quiet, filling every room with the particular restlessness of a man who had defined himself entirely through work and now had none. I had begun, by that point, to write. Nothing serious, or rather, nothing I allowed myself to call serious. Notebooks. Small ones, college ruled, bought 3 at a time from the drugstore for $4.99. I wrote in the mornings, before Robert woke up, at the kitchen table with my coffee. Stories, mostly. Observations. Sometimes just sentences that felt true in a way I couldn't explain. I had filled 23 notebooks by March of 2003. That Wednesday morning I was writing when I heard Robert's footsteps on the stairs earlier than usual. I moved to close the notebook. Not quickly, just a small, habitual motion. The motion of a woman who has been making herself smaller for so long she no longer notices the effort. But he had already seen. He poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down across from me. He looked at the notebook. He looked at me. And then he said something that he meant, I am almost certain, as a compliment. "Maggie," he said, "what are you going to do with all that?" Not cruelly. Not dismissively. With the genuine, mild curiosity of a man who had never once considered that a thing might have value simply because it existed. Simply because it was mine. I looked at him across the kitchen table, the same kitchen table we had owned since 1974. with the scratch along the left side from when Daniel was 7 and dragged a toy truck across it, and I felt something shift inside me. Not break. Shift. Like a bone that has been set wrong for decades and finally moves. I said nothing. I closed the notebook. I stood up, walked to the sink, and washed my cup. But something had cracked open that morning that would not close again. Because his question, "What are you going to do with all that?" was not really about the notebooks. It was the question he had been asking me, in 100 different ways, for 45 years. And for 45 years I had answered it the same way. By making it smaller. By putting it away. By washing my cup and starting breakfast. That morning, standing at the sink with the water running cold over my hands, I finally heard the question for what it truly was. It was not "What are you going to do with all that?" It was "Why do you believe you are allowed to want anything at all?" I turned off the tap. I stood very still. Outside, a bird was hitting the same note over and over in the oak tree by the window. I have had 15 years since Richard died to think about what happened to my life. 15 years of mornings with no one else's schedule to organize, no one else's coffee to pour, no one else's needs arriving before my own, like uninvited guests who never learned to knock. And here is what I have come to understand. I did not sacrifice myself for Robert. That is the story I told for decades, and it is wrong not because it is too harsh on him, but because it is too easy on me. Sacrifice implies a moment of decision. A conscious choice made with open eyes. What I did was quieter and more insidious than sacrifice. I practiced disappearance. Every time I closed a notebook. Every time I threw away a job advertisement. Every time I answered the question, "What do you want?" with "Whatever you think is best," I was not giving something to Robert. I was taking something from myself. Slowly. Methodically. The way you don't notice a room growing dark until you can no longer read in it. I call it practice disappearance because it was not forced upon me all at once. It was a habit, and like all habits, it began with one small motion repeated until it required no thought at all. The motion, in my case, was closing the notebook. There is a question I wish someone had asked me in 1958, standing in that kitchen with the yellow walls and the smell of fresh paint and the telephone still warm from the call I had just made to decline the only offer that ever came dressed in my exact size. The question is not "What do you want?" Women of my generation were asked that question plenty. We simply had no practice answering it honestly. The question is this: what have you stopped reaching for so gradually that you've forgotten you ever wanted it? Sit with that. Don't answer quickly. The honest answer never comes quickly. Because the things we abandon rarely leave in one dramatic moment. They leave the way I left that publishing job, not with a door slamming, but with a polite phone call, a reasonable explanation, and the quiet promise to ourselves that there will be another chance. That the timing is simply not right. That we are being mature, practical, selfless. We are very good at naming cowardice with dignified words. I filled 23 notebooks that no one ever read. 23 notebooks of a woman who heard what language was trying to say the dean's words, not mine, and spent 60 years whispering it only to herself in the hour before anyone else woke up. After Robert died, I bought a 24th notebook. I wrote in it every morning. I still do. I am 90 years old and my handwriting has gotten small and my hands ache in the cold, and I write anyway. Not because it will become anything. Not because anyone will publish it or read it or call it remarkable. Because it is mine. Because I am finally, at 90, practicing the opposite of disappearance. I am learning to take up space. You are going to tell yourself that your situation is different. That you have real responsibilities, real constraints, real reasons why now is not the right time. And some of those reasons are true. I am not dismissing them, but let me ask you something, and I want you to hear it the way I wish I had heard it at 37. Sitting at Patricia Wren's kitchen table feeling more alive than I had in 15 years. How long have you been making yourself smaller for someone who has never once been asked to do the same for you? I am not telling you to leave. I am not telling you to burn anything down. I kept my marriage. I loved Robert, in the complicated, worn smooth way you love someone you have built an entire life beside, but love and disappearance are not the same thing, and for too long I confused one for the other. There is a version of your life where you take up the space you were given. Where you answer the question honestly. Where you stop reaching for the notebook and then pulling your hand back before anyone notices. I found that version at 85. I want you to find it considerably sooner. This morning I woke up at 5:30, the way I always do now. The body forgets how to sleep long before the mind forgets anything else. I made my coffee. I sat at the kitchen table, not the one from 1974. That one is long gone, but a small round one I bought myself the year after Robert died, white, just big enough for one person, and a notebook. I opened the 24th notebook. The first page still has the same words I wrote the morning after his funeral. When the house was finally quiet and the relatives had gone home, and I sat down without thinking and let my hand move. I am 75 years old and I am starting. I looked at that sentence now, and I feel two things at once: grief for the woman who wrote it so late, and something close to tenderness for her. She was terrified. She had not written a single word in 40 years that she allowed herself to take seriously. Her handwriting on that first page is uneven, slightly too large, like a child just learning that letters have weight. She was learning. At 75. Because the woman who stood in a yellow kitchen in 1958 and made a phone call, she spent the rest of her life regretting that woman never disappeared entirely. She just waited. In 23 notebooks. In the fold of an old textbook. In the slight hesitation of a hand moving towards something and then pulling back. She waited until the house was quiet enough to hear her. Robert asked me once, near the end, if I was happy. It was late, we were in bed, the room was dark. I said yes. And I meant it partially, honestly, in a way that a partial truth can still be true. But what I did not say, what I had no words for then, was this: I could have been more. Not more successful. Not more recognized. Not more anything the world would have noticed or measured or rewarded. Just more myself. That is the only regret that has weighed at 90. Not the money I didn't make. Not the title I didn't hold. Not the city I didn't live in. The self I didn't let exist. The bird is back in the oak tree this morning, same note, over and over, the way it always is in early spring. I noticed it first on that Wednesday in March of 2003, the morning Robert asked me what I was going to do with all that, and I stood at the sink with cold water running over my hands and finally heard the real question underneath. I hear it differently now. It doesn't sound like an accusation anymore. It sounds like an invitation. What are you going to do with all that? I pick up my pen.